Teenage girls in wooden planes versus Germany's finest. It sounds like a fantasy, but it wasn't. It was real. It happened in the dark skies of World War II, where a group of young Soviet women defied every expectation, every fear, and every limit of human courage. They weren't flying steel war machines. They weren't given the best aircraft or the latest technology. They were given fragile, outdated wooden planes, machines so light that you could hear the wind moan through the frame. And yet, these girls turned them into weapons of terror. The Germans had a name for them, Nachthexen, the night witches. They flew in the dead of night, no lights, no parachutes, no mercy. Their engines would cut off mid-air, gliding silently through the darkness until they reached their target. By the time the German soldiers looked up, it was too late. The faint sound of the wind slicing through the sky was the last thing they'd ever hear before the bombs dropped. Imagine it. You're a German soldier on the Eastern Front. The night is quiet. Then suddenly, you hear a faint whoosh over your head. The sky seems to move. And then fire, explosions, chaos. You shoot at the darkness, but there's nothing to see. Just shadows, ghosts, and then they're gone, vanishing into the cold Russian sky like whispers of death. The men who faced them said the sound of their gliding planes was like the sound of witches flying on broomsticks, hence the name, the Night Witches. But these weren't supernatural beings. They were teenage girls, students, daughters, nurses. Women who left behind everything they knew to fight a war that didn't want them. When the Soviet Union called for volunteers, thousands of young women stepped forward. They wanted to defend their homeland. But the generals laughed. Women in combat? Unthinkable. Yet one woman refused to accept no. Her name was Marina Roskova, a famous Soviet pilot known as the Russian Amelia Earhart. Roskova had already broken records in aviation, but now she had a new mission, to create an all-female air regiment. Stalin himself signed the order in 1941. That was the birth of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, the only all-female combat unit in aviation history. Everything about them was symbolic. Their uniforms were hand-me-downs from men, too big, too heavy. Their boots stuffed with paper so they wouldn't slip off. Their planes? The Polikarpov PO-2, a flimsy biplane made of plywood and canvas, originally designed for training and crop dusting. Against German Messerschmitts and anti-aircraft guns, it was suicide. But to these women, it was freedom. They painted stars on their wings. They sewed charms into their jackets. And when the sun went down, they took to the skies. Each carried 2 bombs, one under each wing. They would fly multiple missions a night, as many as 15, returning only to refuel and rearm. Their strategy was both simple and terrifying. Flying low, they would approach their targets in silence, cut the engine just before reaching enemy lines, and glide. No sound, no warning. Then the bombs would fall. The Germans would panic, firing wildly into the dark, often hitting nothing. And before they could react, the Night Witches were already gone, vanished into the night. But the danger was real. If they were hit, there was no armor, no protection. A single bullet could set the plane ablaze. Some crashed and burned, some were captured, but most kept flying, night after night, mission after mission. They learned to read the sky like a map. The stars were their compass, the moon their ally. They could tell direction by the smell of the forest, the curve of the river, or the sound of wind shifting against their wings. These weren't just pilots, they were hunters, predators of the night. And the fear they created was unmatched. German soldiers began to dread the night itself. They said, when the witches fly, we can't sleep. They would shoot flares into the sky, trying to expose the shadows. But the girls were too fast, too silent. For every one that went down, 3 more took her place. By 1943, the Night Witches had become legend. Their missions crippled German supply lines, destroyed ammunition depots, and shattered morale. But behind the legend were real human beings, girls who sang songs to calm their nerves before takeoff, who braided each other's hair under dim lanterns, who wrote letters home they might never send. They were proud, but they were scared. Every night could be their last. In the freezing Russian winters, their hands would stick to the metal controls. They had no radios, no radar, no oxygen, just instinct and bravery. When the mission was over, they'd land in muddy fields, their planes riddled with holes, frost covering their faces, and yet they'd smile. Because they'd made it back, because they'd done what no one thought possible. One pilot later said, "We were called witches, but we were just girls who wanted to protect our home." And that's what made them terrifying. They didn't fight for glory or medals. They fought because they had to. Because every night they took off, they knew if they failed, someone's village would burn, someone's family would die. The Night Witches became one of the most decorated units in the Soviet Air Force. 23 of them were awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. But the cost was brutal. Many never returned. Their planes would vanish into the night, swallowed by fire or silence, their names written only in logbooks that few would ever read. Still, their legend spread. Even the German command admitted it. These women are some of the most fearless pilots we have ever faced. And as the war dragged on, the Night Witches only became more relentless. They didn't stop, they didn't rest. Their thin, wooden planes carried the weight of an entire nation's defiance. Each night as they climbed into the black sky, they carried more than bombs. They carried a message, one the Nazis could never silence. That courage has no gender, that fear can't stop fire, that even in the darkest night, witches still fly.
They had already become legends and whispers, ghosts that haunted the night sky. But legends don't come from luck. They come from blood, sacrifice, and an unbreakable will to keep going when the whole world expects you to fall. By 1943, the Night Witches were flying deep into enemy territory, striking harder and farther than ever before. The Eastern Front had turned into a hell of smoke and frost, and the Germans were desperate to crush the Soviet spirit. But every time they thought they had broken it, the sound of the Night Witches returned, that faint, eerie glide of wooden wings that meant death was coming. Their base was nothing more than a stretch of frozen earth. No hangars, no runways, just open fields covered in snow and mud. Mechanics worked with bare hands in sub-zero temperatures, fixing bullet-riddled planes with scraps of wire and wood. Fuel was scarce, and the smallest mistake could mean death. Yet, every night, those young women climbed back into the cockpit. Their commander, Yevdokia Bershanskaya, ran the unit with quiet fire. She didn't tolerate weakness, but she understood fear. She'd look her pilots in the eyes and say, "You are soldiers now, and soldiers don't die. They fight until there's nothing left to fight with." One of the youngest, Nadezhda Popova, was just a teenager when she started flying. Her brother had been killed by the Germans. For her, every mission was personal. She said later, "Each time I took off, I thought, this one is for him." She flew over 800 missions, 800 nights of facing fire, cold, and death. The Night Witches developed a system. 3 planes would fly together. 2 would attract the attention of German searchlights in anti-aircraft fire, dodging and weaving in the sky. The 3rd, with its engine cut off, would glide silently toward the target and release the bombs. Then they'd rotate again and again through the blackness. It was teamwork born from trust and desperation. Sometimes the sky would light up like daylight, filled with tracer rounds, flak bursts, and flames. But these girls didn't flinch. They flew low, sometimes just 1,500 feet off the ground, close enough to feel the heat of explosions below them. They carried no parachutes. Why? Because their wooden planes were so light that a single parachute added too much weight. If something went wrong, there was no escape. You either made it home or you died in the dark. But to the night witches, that risk was part of the job. They learned to read the rhythm of anti-aircraft fire, to know when to dive and when to climb. They could fly by instinct, by feel, by the tremble of the wind against the frame. Some said they could sense danger before they saw it, like wild animals who'd become one with the night. There were times when they'd return from a mission and find only half the planes had made it back. The survivors wouldn't cry. They'd stand in silence, looking up at the sky, their faces hard, their hearts broken but unyielding, because tomorrow night they'd have to go again. The Germans became obsessed with stopping them. They put massive bounties on their heads. Any pilot who could shoot down a night witch would earn an Iron Cross. But even with that reward hanging in the air, few succeeded. The Polikarpov PO-2 was so slow that German fighter planes often overshot their targets. The wooden frame made it almost invisible to radar. And when the pilots cut their engines, the soundless glide made them ghosts that couldn't be traced. It was a cruel irony. The same fragile plane that should have doomed them was what made them unstoppable. But there was no glamour in their lives. When they weren't flying, they slept in freezing tents, wrapped in whatever they could find. Their food was thin soup and black bread. They washed in icy rivers. Their faces were chapped, their hands blistered, their eyes hollow from exhaustion. Yet, in the rare quiet moments, they laughed, they sang, they danced in the snow when they could. They painted stars and flowers on their planes, nicknamed them after lovers or lost friends. For a brief moment before each mission, they became girls again, smiling, joking, hiding their fear behind brave faces. One pilot remembered writing a letter home. "If I die, please don't mourn me. I will be in the wind, I will be in the sky." And the sky remembered. There were missions that went horribly wrong. Planes hit mid-air, engines failed over forests, bombs detonated too early. But every time they lost someone, the survivors flew harder the next night. Revenge was their oxygen. Their impact on the German army was staggering. Night after night, the witches destroyed supply depots, railroads, bridges, and command posts. They made the enemy paranoid, sleepless. German officers began to rotate troops more frequently to prevent mental collapse. Some soldiers even claimed they could hear the witches whispering before a raid, phantom voices carried on the wind. The legend grew darker. Some Germans believed the night witches used supernatural powers, that their planes were enchanted, that bullets couldn't hit them because the devil himself protected them. It wasn't magic, it was discipline, courage, and precision born of desperation. And as the front pushed westward, the witches followed, flying deeper into enemy lines, their missions growing longer and deadlier. By 1944, they had completed over 20,000 sorties. That number is hard to imagine. 20,000 times those fragile wooden planes lifted off into the black void, carrying death under their wings. But behind every number was a heartbeat. When the missions ended before dawn, the girls would land, step out into the cold air, and collapse onto the ground. Some kissed the frozen earth, thankful to still be alive. Others just stared at the horizon, knowing that in a few hours they'd have to take off again. The night witches weren't just fighting a war, they were fighting the disbelief of their own comrades. Even some Soviet male pilots mocked them at first, until they saw their kill counts, their precision, and their survival against impossible odds. Soon, respect replaced doubt. By then, even Stalin himself called them the daughters of victory. They didn't see themselves as heroes. They were tired, broken, and scarred. But they kept flying because they had to, because their brothers, fathers, and homes were still under threat. Because stopping meant surrendering, and that was something the night witches could never do. Their wings became symbols of defiance, fragile yet unbreakable. Every mission began with silence, the engine's hum, the cold metal controls, the rush of takeoff. Then darkness, always darkness. And in that black sky, they found something more powerful than fear: purpose. They didn't just fight the enemy, they became the enemy's nightmare. And even now, decades later, when historians speak of bravery in the air, few stories strike as deeply as the girls in those wooden planes, the night witches who turned the night itself into their weapon. As the war dragged into its final brutal years, the night witches had already carved their legend into the frozen skies of Europe. The Germans had learned to fear the dark, not because of monsters or ghosts, but because of the whisper of wings above them. Every night, those fragile biplanes haunted their dreams. Every morning, the wreckage told the story of who had passed through. By 1944, the Soviet army was pushing westward. The tide of the war had turned. The Red Army was advancing, and the night witches followed, flying mission after mission, striking at German bases in Poland, Belarus, and all the way into Eastern Europe. Their flight paths grew longer, their danger multiplied. The farther they went, the less protection they had. Many didn't return, yet still, they went. Every night, every storm, every mission. The average night witch flew up to 15 sorties in a single night. Imagine that, 15 times lifting off into darkness, flying through tracer fire and flak, dropping 2 bombs at a time, refueling, and doing it again. Their skin cracked from the cold, their eyes burned from exhaustion. They didn't care, because every explosion below meant the enemy was bleeding a little more. They were not just pilots now, they were symbols. Symbols of defiance, symbols of endurance, symbols of what it means to fight when the world tells you that you can't. In one mission over the Kuban region, Nadezhda Popova's plane was hit. Holes tore through the wings, the fuel tank was leaking. She was miles behind enemy lines, the ground below lit up with gunfire. But she didn't turn back. She dropped her bombs, completed the mission, and somehow managed to glide back across the front with smoke trailing behind her. When she landed, the plane collapsed under her, but she had made it home. That was the spirit of the night witches. They didn't have heroes among them. They were heroes, every single one. Each girl had faced death hundreds of times, and yet they treated it as routine. They didn't think of themselves as extraordinary, they thought of themselves as necessary. Their commander, Yevdokia Bershinskaya, often said, "The sky doesn't care if you're a man or a woman, it only cares if you can fly." And they could fly, like no one else. The Germans had increased their defenses, but it didn't matter. The witches kept coming. Their missions disrupted supply routes, shattered enemy morale, and slowed the German retreat. They became so effective that German troops began firing blindly into the air every night, wasting ammunition out of sheer fear. The psychological impact was enormous. For the enemy, the sound of silence became terrifying. For the witches, silence was power. But that power came at a price. The more they flew, the more names disappeared from the roster. Sometimes a tent would remain empty after a mission, a bed untouched, a photograph on the wall left behind. There were no funerals, only the sound of the next plane taking off into the cold night. By 1945, the night witches had flown over 30,000 missions and dropped more than 3,000 tons of bombs. They had destroyed train stations, supply dumps, bridges, and enemy positions across vast stretches of Europe. But the war was ending. The sound of the front was fading. The final missions were some of the most dangerous, flying into Germany itself over heavily fortified positions. And then one night, after years of fire, the sky went quiet. The war was over. When the announcement came, many of the women wept, not out of joy, but because they didn't know what life would be without the night, without the sound of wings over wings. For years, the sky had been their home, their battleground, their destiny. They had survived the unimaginable. When they returned, there were no grand parades waiting for them, no cheering crowds. The Soviet Union had won, yes, but these women were soon forgotten, their heroism buried under silence. Some returned to civilian life, others stayed in the military. Most never spoke of what they had done. They went back to ordinary lives, carrying extraordinary memories. But history didn't forget. As the years passed, the truth resurfaced. 23 of the Night Witches were named heroes of the Soviet Union. Hundreds received medals for valor. Their commander, Bershinskaya, was honored for leading one of the most successful air regiments in Soviet history. And yet, their real victory wasn't in medals. It was in the fear they instilled in the enemy and the courage they inspired in the generations that followed. Even the German officers admitted their respect. One report described them as the most relentless pilots in the Red Army. Another said, "They attack from the shadows. You never hear them until the bombs fall." To this day, historians still call them the most successful female combat unit in history. Their wooden planes, the WW2’s, are long gone. Most were destroyed, scrapped, or lost to time. But a few remain in museums, delicate skeletons of fabric and wood that once carried fire through the night. Visitors look at them now and wonder, how could anyone fly this into war? The answer is simple: courage. The Night Witches didn't need armor or power. Their strength was something deeper, something no bullet could pierce. They were the daughters of the storm, the keepers of the night. When asked how she survived, one pilot simply smiled and said, "Because we had no choice. We had to win." That's the part of history people forget, the quiet kind of bravery, the kind that doesn't ask for recognition, the kind that doesn't vanish when the lights go out. For the Night Witches, every night was a gamble, but every dawn was proof they had won, at least one more time. Their story is not just about war. It's about what happens when courage meets necessity, when young women who should have been dreaming of futures instead learn to fly toward fire. And even now, decades later, their spirit still drifts across the skies. When the wind howls at night, some say it carries their memory, the whisper of wings, the echo of bombs, the courage of those who refuse to disappear. The Germans called them witches. The world remembers them as warriors. And the night still belongs to them.